Welcome, everybody. Today's lecture is on overwintering in northern climates, and I'm going to take you through what's happening in the hive, what's happening to our bees. Then we're going to go through a whole process of what are the keys to success for overwintering in northern climates, and then we're going to wrap that up with a step-by-step guide on how you actually prep your hive as far as what it should look like and what should be on it over the course of the winter. So let's jump into it. So you've heard me say this before, we have beekeepers and we have bee havers. And the goal of individuals that are working in the honeybee industry is to be beekeepers. And now beekeepers are distinct from bee havers because beekeepers are able to keep their bees alive every single year. They overwinter their bees. They're able to recover from losses through splits in the spring. And really the idea of a beekeeper is, and ideally, is kind of a person that buys bees once and then from that initial purchase is able to sustainably increase the size of their apiary every single year because of overwintering success and splits. And then we have bee havers. Bee havers are individuals who buy bees every single year and replace those bees every single year by purchasing new bees. Bee havers are really in a tough spot here because really the key to success, to becoming a sustainable operation, meaning that you're able to increase your size without having to purchase new bees, and you're able to provide income to your business through honey sales, really that key to success in northern climates is winter survival. Once you get those initial first-year colonies through the winter, and they haven't had an entire season to build infrastructure in the way of wax and comb in the colony. Once you get past that first year, everything changes. The colonies will put on honey much faster because they already have the infrastructure. The colonies are much larger. They're going to increase fast in the spring. And really, in order to be successful as a beekeeper in northern climates, you have to get your bees through winter. Otherwise, you're just going to keep throwing money at this year after year after year after year and not realize any return on this investment. The return on investment begins with winter survival. So that is why it is so important. And that's why I harp on you all so much in these lectures about things like Varroa management. And you're going to hear me harp about it again today. But that's why these things are so important, because otherwise, this is just going to be a futile effort. And I have seen over my career so many people that have invested so much money into beekeeping, only to leave the industry in 3 to 5 years because they cannot get overwintering down. And the hobby just becomes too expensive. Replacing bees every year is going to be very expensive. You're talking $150 to $200 a pop, whether it's a package or a newt, every single year for every single colony. That is not sustainable. And so winter survival is where you are going to realize success in the beekeeping industry. Now, we have had losses that have just been unsustainable in the beekeeping industry for decades. And you can see here, this is from the Bee Informed Partnership. This is the total managed honeybee colonies in the United States and the estimated losses that we see annually. So you can see on the x-axis, we've got years, and on the y-axis, we've got percent loss. And what you can see is the acceptable level for losses, for annual losses in the honeybee industry. Acceptable losses are about 15%. That's a combined loss of overwintering loss and mid-season loss, because we do have loss that occurs within the season as well. So what you're looking at here is you can see that over time we have had some really substantial losses. You can see here in 2012 and 2013 we lost 45% of the colonies in the United States. That's huge. That is huge. An industry struggles with things like that, where we're having these kind of losses. Could you imagine if the cattle industry was losing almost half of the cattle produced in the United States annually? How big of a news story that would be? So we are really struggling here. And that's why courses like this, you individuals that are taking this education seriously, trying to get the tools in your toolbox so that you can confront this type of a figure head on, that's why this is so important. And overwintering loss is a huge part of this. Most of the time, overwintering loss can be prevented. It's usually correlated to a few key factors, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. What I do want to show you though, or what I do want to tell you though, is that you can see on this graph, the yellow bars are our wintering losses. And in recent years, we've actually seen a lot of improvement in overwintering losses. For example, last year, we had in 2019, so last year, we had overwintering losses that were 22% in the United States. That was down actually 15% from the previous year, so that's really good. But in recent years, we've started cataloging midsummer losses as well. And last year, midsummer losses were 32%, and that was 12% higher than recent years, and actually the highest ever recorded loss during the summer. So there's also losses that are occurring other places. But overwintering loss tends to be one of the bigger ones that we see in the United States. And like I said, most of the time, overwintering loss is completely preventable. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of all of this. All right, so let's first set the stage. What is happening in the winter when we're getting into winter that changes? Well, number one, our temperatures are decreasing. So the overall temperatures are decreasing, and that's going to relate to less foraging time or no foraging time at all. Day length is decreasing. The days are getting shorter. So again, this is an environmental condition that's causing changes to this biological organism, our superorganism, the colony that is existing in this hive. Food is also becoming unavailable. We're here, in the last part, or in September now, and we're starting to see the last forage resources available in the landscape. Goldenrod's still up in some places. We've got asters that are usually late season asters that are usually around here. You got buckwheat around, buckwheat still in flower. But most of those diverse floral resources that are in the landscape that are producing your big honey flows, most of those are gone. So food is becoming very scarce as we enter into the winter. And eventually, we're going to get to a point where food is unavailable completely, and everything that hive needs to survive the winter needs to now be in the hive. So we have to make sure that we give our hives the best conditions possible to make sure that everything they have to survive that long northern winter is in the hive. Other things that are changing right now. We have these environmental conditions that are changing. Floral resources becoming unavailable. What's happening at this same time during this time of the year as we're in fall and we're entering winter, is that winter bees are being put on. So there's actually things that are changing in this individual bees as well during this time of the year. And winter bees are critically important because those are the bees that are going to get you from this season to the next. They are the bridge. They're the bees that are going to live for 4 to 6 months instead of 45 to 60 days. So they are the bridge. And it is critically important that these bees are the healthiest bees that we have. And as we enter winter, these bees that are put on, these winter bees, and you heard me talk about this in the last lecture, that in August and September is when these bees are being put on. When these winter bees are being put on, they are distinctly different than our summer bees. Distinctly different. So much so that some of us in the apiculture industry actually consider winter bees to be a completely separate caste of bees. Because in the traditional sense of the word, a caste is a physically distinct individual or groups of individuals that specialize to perform certain functions within the colony. And the winter bee caste is distinctly different in behavior. It's distinctly different in biology. It has reduced activity because we're not foraging, and it has increased lifespan. So these distinctly different roles that these winter bees play, you can actually consider them a separate caste of bees. because they have such distinct differences. And one example of a change in behavior would be clustering. Another example of changes in biology would be that we see these fat bodies become enlarged in the head and abdomen of the honeybees. And we're going to talk about the roles, the special function of those fat bodies and the critical role they play in winter survival here in just a moment. But these bees are very different than your summer bees. And it's why when we talk about preparing for overwintering, that preparation starts in August. It doesn't start in September. It starts in August, because you have to make sure that these bees are being put on, meaning they are being raised in the healthiest environment possible. Because these winter bees, one of the major things that their survival is directly related to, oops, let's put that back in there. One of the distinct things that is related to the survival and the health of these bees is what? You all should know the answer to this right now, just because of how much I talk about it. The survival of your winter bees is directly linked to Varroa. Directly linked. If you care about anything to get your bees through the winter, it doesn't matter. A lot of the stuff that we talk about are things to support healthy colonies. So when we talk about insulation or wrapping or things like that, those are things to support a healthy colony. When we talk about the things that are critical to survival, this is number one. So if you don't take Varroa management seriously, and again, it is a season-long effort. It doesn't start at the end of the season. If you've waited this long, you probably have missed the boat, because your winter bees have already been being reared. But it's why this is so critical. It is why this is talked about so much, is because this is one of the keys to survival, and it is directly linked to the health of individual bees. So just to recap real quick, why is Varroa a number one priority? Well, it's a global pest. It is present in all bee colonies in the United States. There may be some rarities where someone is in a remote area that's not being exposed, but all of us have Varroa mites. It vectors many viruses that are detrimental to honeybee development. But most importantly, when we talk about this in the context of winter survival, the most important factor to keep in mind is that the Varroa mites feed on an organ called the fat body. And the fat body is really that critical organ that if it is compromised, winter survival is very unlikely. So you're probably asking yourself, maybe you're unfamiliar with the fat body. I've mentioned it in previous lectures, but it's something that's easy to miss, because in the context of just regular survival, we don't talk about it a whole lot when we talk about summer bees. But when we get to winter, it is critically important because of the role it plays in honeybees. So the reason that a lot of us have not heard about this, that Varroa is feeding on the fat body. The fat body is an organ that you basically can kind of compare to a liver in a human, okay? But the reason it's so important is because the Varroa is directly feeding on the fat body, this organ in honeybees. Now, we didn't know this until just recently, and this just highlights why it is so important to maintain a consistent education in honeybees, because we're always learning new things. So for the last few decades, or a couple decades, we've been teaching that Varroa mites fed on the hemolymph of honeybees, their blood. In fact, when we first started teaching Heroes to Hives, that's what we were teaching, because that was the most current scientific knowledge at the time, is that we suspected that they were feeding on hemolymph, transmitting these detrimental viruses that were causing issues for honeybees. But one of the key things that a lot of us in the honeybee industry noticed early on was that colonies that were really high in Varroa mite levels at the end of the season were generally the colonies that died first. A lot of times, colonies that have high Varroa mite levels are usually the colonies that die before the first of the year. And it didn't always make sense why that was the case under the old idea that they were feeding on hemolymph. They just seemed like maybe the virus load was too high and colonies were just succumbing to virus load. But in actuality, that was not the case. And this research that was done, published in early 2019, Sam Ramsey is the individual who discovered this. He was a PhD student in Dennis Van Egeldorf's lab at the University of Maryland when this was discovered. But in early 2019, they published a paper in the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences that blew the door open on the current knowledge that we had at the time that honeybees were being compromised by Varroa mite through hemolymph feeding. And what they determined was, in fact, they weren't feeding on the hemolymph, they were feeding on the fat body. And when that was discovered, all of these things that a lot of us had seen in our own operations early on, like I'd said, if you have high Varroa mite load, you would tend to see that colony succumb to death early in the winter. We saw these things, but when Sam Ramsey came out with this research, this made everything seem to make sense, because we now know that because the Varroa mite is feeding on the fat body, not the hemolymph, that there's cascading effects that happen when the fat body is compromised, which would lead to a colony succumbing very early on in the winter season to Varroa mite. So the fat body as an organ is this really nutrient-rich organ that is critical to honeybee health. It's located near the cuticle of the honeybee, and typically the reason that we see Varroa mites underneath the abdominal segments of honeybees is because that's how they're accessing this organ, is they're getting underneath those abdominal segments, and the fat body is very close to the cuticle, that outside area of the honeybee. So they're feeding directly on this fat body. What the fat body does, I said it's akin to a liver, but what the fat body does is it has these really important roles throughout the season, but a couple that are key when we get into this time of the year. So one of the big roles that the fat body plays is in environmental toxins. It decontaminates environmental toxins. So it actually allows us to break down some of those things that bees are exposed to in the environment, like pesticides. So it's critical in that function. It is also critical as a storage center. What do I mean by that? I mean that this is where all of these things that bees are using to survive long periods of time in the absence of lots of food, this is where they're storing those things. So things like lipids, carbohydrates, amino acids, proteins, that is where these are being stored, are in these fat bodies, these storage centers. So fat bodies are all over in the abdomen of the honeybee and the head of the honeybee. That's where all of these fat, that's where all this storage is taking place. But it all starts with that main organ that's producing all of this. This is also the primary site for protein biosynthesis. And what that means is that's where the proteins are being built. And many of the proteins that are built in the fat body are crucial to the lives of insects in general. And one of the key proteins in that fat body that are being created is vitellogenin. So vitellogenin is classified, when we talk about this, it's not just protein. It's a glycolipid protein, meaning that it has sugar, it has fat, and it has protein. Now, it's primarily a protein-rich substance. So vitellogenin is used by other animals as a precursor for egg yolk, so a protein-rich precursor. But bees use it much more in their physiology than a lot of other insects. And in addition to fat bodies being a storage reserve, they're also important when it comes to things like royal jelly, because workers metabolize vitellogenin to synthesize royal jelly. So without vitellogenin, royal jelly becomes an issue to create. And we all know that royal jelly is a critical component of the first life stages of honeybee brood. In addition, it supports immune response as well. So this is also, vitellogenin also is a very important part of immune response. It is also the compound that is related to prolonged life. So high vitellogenin levels in bees means that they will live longer. And an example of that is your queen. Your queen has very high vitellogenin levels. It's one of the reasons that she can live for many years. So if we don't have high vitellogenin levels, which are biosynthesized in the fat body, so if we have a compromised fat body, that means we cannot create vitellogenin and store vitellogenin. Vitellogenin is so critically important to that long life, but it is also, in addition to all these other important roles, it's also how bees feed their young in the absence of pollen at the beginning of the new season. I hope from all of these things that we're talking about, just for the fat body, that you understand why this is so important. If you have a compromised fat body as a honeybee, as an individual, you will likely not survive very long as a winter bee. You see this picture right here that I have on this? The picture on the right is a healthy bee with lots of fat body storage. All these fat deposits all over this. This is a fat, healthy bee. You want fat, healthy winter bees. The bee on the left, all of that area that's absent of fat deposits, that bee on the left has a compromised fat body and is not able to store those deposits now because of that compromised fat body. The one on the left, Varroa mite compromised. The one on the right is not. These bees right here, from this picture, you can visually see, they're not going to make it through the winter because of those fat deposits. Think of it like a bear. Bears need lots of fat deposits to be able to survive a long hibernation. It's kind of like that, even though bees are not hibernating. So, critically important that you manage Varroa mite, because if you do not, your bees are just biologically not going to have the ability to survive the winter. Plain and simple. And that's because of this compromised fat body. So important. Why is it so important this time of the year? Well, this is a diagram from Randy Oliver. And what you have here on the x-axis is the months of the year. On the y-axis on the left, you have the number of bees in a colony. And on the y-axis on the right, you have the number of mites per colony. And what we see, this is just a general trend that we see with honeybees, is that when we have bees that have mite populations, and this goes for everybody because you all have mites, in the beginning of the season, when you're doing your mite counts in, say, June and July, oftentimes they will come in very low. And the reason is because when we look at these two lines here, the bees being the yellow one and the mites being the red one, you can see as the season progresses, we have this delay. And so there is this lag between the host and the parasite. And the reason for these lags is because the parasite needs lots of hosts in order to explode in population. So you're always going to have the host have a higher population first, and then the parasite is going to catch up and then surpass those levels that we would want to keep them at. And so what you're seeing here is over the course of the season, we see this kind of trend where we have lots of bees in the colony and not so many mites. But generally around July, late July and August, going into September, we have this exponential growth. And the growth of mites is occurring at the same time that bees are starting to shut down. So after the summer solstice, we start to see a contraction in beehive colonies as far as population is concerned. And you can see that peak right here at the end of June, beginning of July. After that date, your populations start to contract within the hive, but at the same time, your mite populations are exploding. And that's why management starting in August is so important, because if you miss this, because we're right here, if you miss this in August, Now you flip this graph where your mite loads are huge and your bee population is quickly declining. That is a recipe for disaster when it comes to trying to keep your bees healthy and trying to keep those fat bodies healthy. So that's why Varroa management needs to be a season-long effort. If you start doing management practices in July and get this under control, this exponential growth will be much, much less. Now, last month's lecture was August. That's when you really need to start prepping. Here in September, mid-September now, you need to get something on quick if you haven't done anything. I'm telling you, literally you're down to days that you can get this a mite treatment on. So if you've done nothing, you've got to do something now, and do something that is the right choice. I go through in the last lecture all sorts of modes of action that we use, all the products that we use in order to look at to determine what is the right product to use right now, because your days are short. You don't have 60 days for an application. So make sure you review that material if you are in the boat where you have not done anything yet. Okay? All right. So that's what's happening to the individual. And again, a recap of why Varroa is so important to winter bees. And the management of them is so important to the health of your winter bees. So what's happening in the colony? So that was what's happening to the bees. What's happening to the colony overall at this time of the year? Number one is brood rearing is going to come to an end. We're getting into the last days of the season. Winter bees are being put on actively right now, and you're going to see your colony start to shut down at some point. They shut down the brood chamber and they start backfilling it with honey. So brood rearing is coming to an end. In addition, a new behavior starts to arise this time of the year, and that's called clustering. And I'm going to talk about clustering here for just a little bit. So clustering is how bees thermoregulate the colony over the course of the winter. Clusters start to form at around mid-60-degree temperatures, and they'll be very loose clusters at higher temperatures, and then as the temperatures get colder, the cluster will contract. So the tightness of the cluster is related to the temperature, the ambient temperature. The cluster as a unit over the course of the winter moves up. Rarely does it move laterally. It will expand to access to resources on the left or right of it when conditions allow it to. But for the most part, that cluster is going to move up as a unit over the course of the winter. This is why in northern climate, top bar hives that do not have honey storage above the cluster are so difficult to get through the winter. You can do it, but it's much more difficult because you can't store those resources above unless you have like a long lang hive where it's a long hive that has had Langstroth hive adapted to the top of it. But for the most part, that's why Langstroth hives work so well, is because they're oriented in the natural fashion that bees are going to use over the course of the winter, which is they move up as a unit, feeding on honey stores above them to regulate temperature. And what this cluster looks like is this. So over the course of the year, over the course of the winter, they're going to be moving up as a unit. And as they move up as a unit, they are feeding on honey. That honey is the calorie intake that they need in order to create heat. Okay? And the heat that they're producing is being produced by bees in the cluster after they feed on honey. So the thing to think about here is that the cluster is a superorganism, and it is thermoregulating that superorganism as a unit. And there are two critical parts to this unit, the mantle and the core. Now on this diagram that you can see here, you can see that the purple areas here and you have the red and yellow areas here. The purple areas are the mantle, and the yellow and red area is the core. The mantle is the older bees in the colony, and what they're doing as that outer layer is they're facing inside to the cluster. So their heads are facing in, and the thoracic hairs that are on their bodies they'll get so tight that they'll interlace. and create this mantle layer that has the same insulative properties as essentially down feathers. And what they do as a unit is they will actually pack together and expand based on the need to conserve heat or dissipate heat. So the way that they're producing that heat is they feed on honey, and then they use their indirect flight muscles to shiver. And so they start to shiver, and that's how they create heat. So honey is the currency of heat in the winter. Without honey, you cannot thermoregulate, which is why it's so important to make sure you do not harvest too much. You've got to leave them enough food to be able to thermoregulate that entire winter. And for us in the UP, I mean, we're talking like 4 to 6 months of solid winter. So that's a lot of honey that they need on to be able to thermoregulate during that time. So the mantle is where the heat's being produced. And then we have the core. The core is where the younger bees and the queen are. And the core is a much more loosely packed area than the mantle. And what the function of the core is the core is basically their function is to control heat exchange within the cluster. So they're the ones that are basically controlling all of that heat exchange. So these bees in this superorganism, just like we've talked about in the past, think about your colony as like a 15 to 20 pound organism. These bees are thermoregulating together collectively for the survival of the colony. It's very cool behavior. The 3 ways that thermoregulation is occurring within this cluster and how heat is being transferred throughout the colony are 3 ways. Conduction is one of them. That's the transfer of heat by touching. So the bees touching one another and transferring heat to each other. The second is radiant heat. That's the energy from nearby bees. So the radiant heat coming from nearby bees that are shivering. And then we have convection, which is via air movement. That's heat rising and cold air falling in the colony over the cluster. So these are the 3 ways that they're conducting thermoregulation in the colony. Now, as they are thermoregulating, there is heat loss. One of the ways that we talked about heat being produced and moving in the colony is through convection. So you have cold air coming over the colony and it is removing heat. So that heat loss is being replaced by those shivering mantle bees. They are replacing the heat loss. And again, to reiterate, honey is the calories that fuels the shivering that produces heat. So this clustering behavior is very critical to the survival of honeybees. It is an amazing adaptation that honeybees have evolved with over millennia to be able to survive well in northern climates. This is also why it is ridiculous when people say that they cannot keep bees in Michigan because it's too cold. The native range of bees goes well up into areas of Sweden, Norway. Bees are very well adapted for cold, even in native ranges. And we have a very lucrative beekeeping industry in Canada where it gets much colder than it does in Michigan. So bees are well adapted to survive cold. Cold is not killing your honeybees. Something else is killing your honeybees. And like I said earlier, most overwintering loss is preventable. What are the keys then to your survival for overwintering loss? Well, here they are. And we're going to go through each one of these. Number 1, Varroa managed. Number 2, you have enough food. Number 3, you have airflow. Number 4, there's moisture being managed within the colony. 5, there's some insulation. And then we'll talk about wrapping as well as a key to survival over the winter in northern climates. So let's jump into it. You already know what the first one is. Varroa. You already hit it once again today. And I hope I've hit it in every single lecture to underscore how important it is to you. Again, and I've said this before, when students start taking Varroa management seriously is when I start to see students have overwintering survival success. I've been teaching this course now for 5 years, and that is one commonality that I have seen through hundreds of students. Is when they start to take this seriously is when bees start living through the winter. So it's a season-long effort. Your monitoring is key to know when you need to be treating and if you are above economic thresholds where you're starting to now lose money and lose bees because of Varroa mite infestation. 3% infectivity is the level that we use to determine if we need to treat. That's our economic injury level. And then winter bees, again, will not survive if Varroa is not managed. Now, that's not to say that I don't get folks from time to time. I had a call with someone yesterday who has never managed Varroa mite and thought that success was getting one hive to survive last year out of 6. That's not success. And just because you happen to get one hive that made it through does not mean that Varroa management is not super important. It just means that somehow your bees were able to manage Varroa on their own because you weren't helping them. So taking this seriously is important. And really, when you take it seriously is when you're going to start to see survival. So that's Varroa management number 1. Number 2 is food. Now, many of you ask me questions all the time about how much food do I need to leave on? How much honey do I need to leave on? There's no hard and fast rule for any of this. You are dealing with a biological organism. And one of the things I hope you realize is that working with biological organisms, there is a lot of room for variability, let's say. So if we're talking Michigan, and you see on the slide here, I have 100 to 150 pounds of honey per hive is what I like to have on my hives going into the winter. If you're down on the border of Michigan or in some southern states, you do not need this much honey. Maybe 75 pounds or 50 pounds is fine. But this is going to be regional specific, and it is also related to the length of your winter. So if you have a harsh winter, we had a really harsh winter in 2013 in most of the northern parts of the country, where places like Lansing in lower Michigan saw snowfall that they hadn't seen in 100 years and had a really long winter. You were light on resources that year, meaning maybe 50 pounds of honey works for you every single year. But that year, if you didn't have more, you could have gotten into trouble because of the length of the winter. So this is all related to your environment as well. But in general, 100 to 150 pounds of honey is going to be plenty to get you through a winter. That now comes down to, well, what does that look like, Adam? And I've been teaching people long enough to understand that for beginners, it's hard to imagine what that looks like in a colony. As you work with bees for years and years and years, you will get to the point where you can just grab a handhold on the front of your hive and lift it and be able to tell if you've got enough honey in there or not. But I know for some of you that are getting started, you want some concrete way or some way that you can say, okay, I think I have enough, because you don't have that frame of reference. And so that's what I'm going to give you here. So it says here 160 pounds to 210 pounds of total hive weight. The way that I come to that total hive weight is through these pictures that you see here. So what I have here is an analog bathroom scale, like a $10 bathroom scale I bought from the hardware store. And what I do to get a rough idea, now this is not exact, but it's going to give you a rough idea of total hive weight. You go to the front of the hive, always start with the front of the hive first, because once you tip this back, you're going to start getting bees coming out of the front entrance. So start with the front of the hive. You can see the hive is ratchet strapped so that it doesn't, when I'm tipping it, it doesn't fall apart if you've already kind of loosened up some of these propolis seals. So make sure you've got this hive ratchet strapped before you start tipping things backwards. You're going to put your scale under the front of the hive. I usually have a mark across the middle of my scale that I use as a reference point. So I put that mark right where the hive is coming down on it. I take that weight and then I go around to the back, lift the hive up, put the scale under, take that weight, add those two numbers together, and you've got a total hive weight, a rough total hive weight. Now, what can you do with that? Well, now you can actually do some pretty easy math to determine what kind of excess weight is due to honey, bees as well, and the resources like wax that are there as well. So it's not an exact measurement, but it gives you a rough idea. So what you have here in this table is rough hive weights of, or rough component weights of your hive. So you can see in 10 frame equipment, you have your equipment column and your weight. 10 frame equipment, if you have a deep hive body with frames and foundation that is undrawn, your hive body weighs about 15 pounds. This was done with man-like equipment. So this is going to also be a little bit different based on manufacturer. But again, this is a rough estimate. You're not trying to get exact hive weight here. You just want to get an idea if you have enough honey or not. So you can add how many deeps you've got. And then if you're using 8 frame equipment, here's the measurements for that as well. Then you have your bottom board, your inner cover, your telescoping cover, or if you're using a migratory cover instead. And there's the weights for that. You add all your equipment that's on that hive together, and then you subtract it from the total hive weight, and that is going to give you a rough idea of what you have in the way of honey. Now, always keep in mind, you're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 pounds, maybe 15 pounds of bees, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, that are part of this. So again, a rough estimate. But with that, when you subtract those two numbers, you're going to get a good idea of how much honey is on the colony. And again, you want to be somewhere, depending on where you're at, I'll say somewhere between 75 and 150 pounds in Michigan, depending on, and you can basically draw a line from north to south. The higher north you go, the more honey you need, because the longer the winters are. So something to keep in mind. And the colder temperatures we tend to get as well. So that's how you get a rough idea of how much honey you have on your colony. Again, this is something that over time you're not going to do. I haven't weighed hives in years, except for at Heroes to Hives workshops, because I've got that sense of what is a heavy hive. But you're going to want to early on, you're going to want to get an understanding of what that actually feels like. And so getting a weight measurement and then, feeling how heavy the hive is based off total hive weight, you do this a few times, you're going to get a really good idea of what a full colony looks like going into winter with honey stores. All right, so also related to food, so we have the weights now that we've determined. You've also got to make sure that the orientation of the food is correct. A lot of times when folks first get beginning in beekeeping, you'll get situations where you over super and the bees don't actually fill out all the frames in a super, and they'll just move up and start filling out more honey in another super without completely filling out a super below. When that happens, and this is very common, especially when you're first getting started, what you need to do at this time of the year is you need to start consolidating those resources. And what I mean by that is you need to make sure that the brood that's down in the bottom of the box, as the brood chamber that has the cluster down in the bottom of the box, that when they start moving up into those top honey supers, that there are no gaps in resources when they hit that super, meaning that the supers directly above the brood chamber need to be completely filled with honey. So you want to make sure every single frame is a frame of honey. Because if you have a situation where you leave a gap in resources, say the middle 3 frames don't have any honey, but the outside frames do, that gap in resources, your cluster may hit that gap in resources and stop, and will starve in place, even though there's food resources all around them, because the cluster moves up as a unit. It doesn't separate to get to these food resources, even if the food resource is 1 frame away. They will starve in place. And the way that you can determine this, and I see it time and time again when I get phone calls for dead outs, is that folks will tell me, Adam, I had food all around them. There's just a dead cluster in place, and their heads are poked all the way as far as they can get into the cells that they were working on. Butts in the air. When you see those butts in the air in your colonies on a dead out, that is a key indication that they died from starvation, because they were trying to get every last morsel of anything in those cells. But in these situations where you have a gap in resources, you left an empty section in a honey super, and they hit that section, they're not going to move somewhere else to find that honey. The honey needs to be right there. and you will get a colony that will starve in place if the honey is not in the right place. So as good practice, especially for beginning beekeepers, it is a good idea to go through those supers that are above your brood chamber and make sure they are solid resources, solid honey all the way across, no gaps, no empty frames, just honey. So that's really important. So that's one thing you should be doing right now. And actually, I'm going to be doing it this weekend. And actually, I'm going to be filming some of our stuff this afternoon out in my apiary doing this, consolidating resources and showing you what it looks like. But you just want to make sure that every frame has honey. And you look down in this picture right here on the right, you can see all my bees down there below. And I have gone through this honey super, and every single frame is capped honey in there. If you don't have all capped honey, uncapped honey, put it in there as well. But you want to make sure those frames are full, that they're not partially filled frames. Lots of food resources in there. Okay, so if you are short on food, meaning you've got colonies that are light, you've done your weights, you've consolidated your resources, and now you realize that, well, this colony that I thought had two honey supers full, once I consolidated it down, I really only had one, and now I'm worried that maybe I don't have enough honey to get through the winter. You can feed heavy this time of the year, and I would recommend that if you've got colonies that are light, especially if you don't have any other colonies to support them with, feed them now, feed them often, feed them until the end, until they stop taking it at the end of the season. But they need to put on these resources as quickly as possible. If you do have other hives and you have a weak colony or a couple weak colonies, you can combine them. So you can combine a couple weak colonies together to boost their resources. And so, you know, like I said, maybe you have one colony that has half a super that's full of honey, and you've got another colony that's got maybe 3/4 of a super that's full of honey, both weak colonies. Put those two together, and now you've got a pretty darn decent colony to make it through the winter. And again, take your losses in the winter or in the fall, because you can always increase your size of your apiary off of splits. So you took 2 colonies that you may have lost during the winter because they didn't have enough food. You made them into 1. Now it's a big, strong colony that makes it through the winter. And now you're going to take that big, strong colony in the spring and split it into 2 or 3 hives. And you've recovered your losses. Cut your losses now. Trying to limp weak colonies with not a lot of food through the winter is a losing strategy. And now, like I said, you can combine 2 weak colonies, or if you have another strong colony, combine that weak colony with a strong colony. Strong, healthy colonies make it through the winter. It is key. During the winter, you're also going to want to do periodic checks on your colony. Yes, that means getting out in the snow and checking your bees. The inside of the colony, the inside of the hive, is not thermoregulated. They don't heat the inside of the hive. They heat the cluster. And what happens as far as heat within the hive is just radiant heat from the cluster. But the cluster itself is not heating the inside of the hive. So it is okay to open a hive on a decent day during the winter and peek inside. You're not going to be pulling any frames out or anything. You're just going to peek. And that's what this picture is right here. So this is in my own operation. In the winter time and through the beginning of the spring, if I have colonies that are really huge, I will check on them periodically every maybe 4 to 6 weeks, just to see where the cluster is at. As I said, the cluster moves up as a unit over the course of the winter. So the way that you do periodic checks to make sure you are still good on food resources is that you go out, you open up the colony, just the top, and you peek in. And if you see something like what we have pictured here on the left, where you have a bunch of bees at the top of the colony, that means that that colony has essentially gone through all of the honey. The cluster has now reached the top. And if you don't do something with a colony in this situation, it will starve because there's nothing else there. If the cluster is a box lower than the top cover, you know they have an entire super to go through before they run out of food. So this is a very easy way to prevent starvation during the winter. And I just read an article in Bee Culture last night that kind of said that the 2 top things to get winter survival are Varroa mites under control and that you don't starve your bees. In this situation, this is the situation that is really kind of upsetting for a lot of beekeepers. You get your bees almost all the way through winter. You hit spring, early part of spring, which is a very vulnerable time for honeybees. And you got this colony through, you see them flying on these nice days, and then all of a sudden the colony's dead. And you're like, man, I got my bees all the way to March, and now they died? What's going on? 99.9% of the time, your bees just ran out of food. Totally preventable. All you need to do is make sure you go out and do a quick check. In my situation, I put on snowshoes, get out in that 3 foot of snow, and I go out to my colonies and I check. I usually wait for a sunny day, one of those days that's kind of like in the high 30s or something like that, and literally you are just peeking in there. You're propping it open, looking to see where the bees are and shutting it. If you see them on the top, the solution for that is the picture on the right, is that you can add supplemental feed. You can prevent starvation. Overwintering does not have to be a hands-off process. We don't just go into the fall, put our bees in the winter, and pray to the bee gods that our bees survive the winter. No, that's not how it works. You can be an active participant in this, and you can prevent honeybee loss due to starvation very easily by just checking on your bees in the winter. That may mean that you have to brush some snow off the top or throw some snowshoes on. You have always got to remember this: these animals are livestock. They rely upon you for a lot of the things that they need to survive these long winters, because we are keeping them as livestock. So keep that in mind. What you see pictured to the right here, this is the mountain camp method. This is the method that I use, and I've used them all as far as how to supplementally feed, fondant, candy boards, all of that good stuff. 13 years of beekeeping, I can tell you that the mountain camp method is by far the easiest and least time consuming process to putting food on. If you want to make candy boards, you got to make them, they got to set. Sometimes they don't get enough water, sometimes they get too much water. You don't need to do any of that. The mountain camp method works just fine. All it is when you see the colony, like pictured on the left, you throw a sheet of newspaper down, you cover it in dry sugar that you just pour out of a bag, and that is perfect. They will feed on that sugar. Also, the other nice thing about the sugar is it will absorb water. And we'll talk about that in just a few slides here, how much water plays a role in winter survival. And water mitigation, I should say. So that is what you can do. You can supplement food. You do not have to just let your bees try and make it through the winter, because especially in the latter part of the season, when we tend to get into February into March, that's when this really becomes critical, is that your bees have been through a lot of the winter. They now have gone through a lot of their resources, and depending on the size of the colony, they may or may not need supplemental food. And I can tell you from experience, my larger Saskatraz colonies that are, we're talking like 3 to 4 boxes deep of cluster, those colonies motor through honey. And if I have anything less than 150 pounds on there, I am always supplementally feeding, because they just motor through honey because it's such a big colony going through the winter. I haven't seen that on other colonies, but the Saskatraz, I definitely see that every single year. Airflow is a key consideration. Air movement is going to be needed within the colony to circulate fresh air into the colony and remove some of the moisture that's in the colony. Now, you don't want to have huge holes. You want to have small enough holes to just let airflow through. We're not trying to vent the entire hive, because keep in mind, there is radiant heat in that hive, and as heat is rising, some of that heat is being retained. And the more heat we retain in the colony, the less the bees are going to have to use honey, because the amount of honey that they use to create heat is correlated to the temperature. The colder it gets, the more honey they have to consume to maintain heat. So if we can contain some of that heat, then we don't have to use as much honey. So we don't want a ton of holes. What I would recommend is on your bottom entrance, you're going to have your smallest bottom entrance on your entrance reducer going into winter. For your top entrance, something between a 1/2 inch and a 3/4 inch hole is all you need. Anything more than that, you're going to end up losing heat. You may get great moisture management, but they're going to be motoring through honey much faster because they're not retaining as much heat. So you don't want too many holes. One is plenty. You can make this top entrance by drilling a hole in your top box, or you can use a spacer. And I'm going to talk about why spacers are important. In this situation, that's what you see on both of these pictures. Is you can't see it in this wrap hive, but you see this hole on top. That's on a 2x1 spacer. This one over here, I believe that's on like a 3/4 inch spacer. But you can see both of them. This is a relatively large hole, so this would be about as large as you would want to make it, 3/4 inch, I think that is. It might be an inch now that I look at that. But this is one, I think Better Bee is who sells that spacer. And this is kind of your more traditional spacer here for a top entrance. But either one of them will work just fine in this situation. You want to make sure you have a top and bottom entrance to keep that airflow going through the colony over the course of the winter. The other thing that you need to consider for a key to success is moisture management. This is another preventable thing that a lot of folks deal with as far as colonies dying. Your bees respire as they are consuming honey and heating the colony. What that means is that you have water that is being produced by these bees over the course of the season. And when we say you want 100 pounds of honey on your colony, when that colony has consumed 100 pounds of honey over the course of the season, that is about 4 gallons of water that they're producing by feeding on that honey. That is a tremendous amount of water. It has to be, something has to be done with it in the hive. It has to go somewhere, right? What we want to make sure is that when it comes to moisture management is that we are ensuring that that moisture that is coming off the cluster does not come back to the cluster in the form of precipitation. Because bees can tolerate a lot of cold temperature, but wet bees cannot tolerate any cold temperature. Wet bees will freeze in place, period. So if your bees are getting wet during the winter, this is another situation where Adam gets a phone call in the beginning of the spring and says, Adam, I had honey everywhere. My cluster was right in the middle of all the honey. It was right above them as well. What happened? The first question I ask is, what was your moisture management technique? And most of the time, there's dead silence, or I didn't use anything, or what are you talking about? And in those situations, what has happened most of the time is that your cluster, oh, let's go to the next slide. I made a handy dandy graphic for y'all to illustrate this. All right, so this is our colony. You have your cluster here, your hive bodies, your outer cover, your bottom board. The cluster is putting off heat, water, and carbon dioxide. Like we said, hot air is rising. So this hot, moist air rises in the colony. And when it hits a cold surface, that hot air is going to condense, just like on your soda can. And when that condensation occurs, the last place we want condensation to occur is right above the cluster. Because if it does occur above the cluster, that water rains right back down on the cluster and freezes the cluster out. And that is the solution to the phone call I got, is that you didn't have your moisture managed and your cluster froze out because it got wet, because of all the humidity coming off of it. So when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the importance of moisture management, we're not talking about physically removing the moisture. We're talking about displacing the moisture, making sure that it doesn't occur right above the cluster so that it won't freeze it out. It's going to occur somewhere in the colony. It has to. The warm, that condensation, that warm air is going to interact with the cold surface somewhere in the colony. And what we're trying to do through moisture management is we're trying to make sure that the top cover is not the coldest portion of the hive. That surface at the top of the colony is not the coldest surface. This also is kind of double-sided. So in addition to that area being the coldest surface, if we do nothing for moisture management, this is also the same place, the top of the hive, where most of heat loss occurs. It's, in fact, it's where 75% of the heat loss in a colony occurs, is through the top. So you're only losing 25% of your heat from the sides. And I want you to keep this in mind when we talk about insulation, because most of your heat is not being lost through the sides of your colony. It's being lost through the top of your colony. So why that's so important for moisture management and for heat loss management? One, we need to have some sort of a way to mitigate moisture. And I'm going to talk about that in the step-by-step. What is the solution for this? This is just setting you up. We're going to talk about how we mitigate moisture, because we don't want moisture to interact with the cluster. But this goes right along with the next step, which is insulation. So by creating a top surface that is the warmest surface in the colony, we are going to displace that moisture. And the way that we do that is by insulating the top cover, so that this moisture does not rain down, it doesn't accumulate on the inner cover, but rather, if we insulate that top cover, it will accumulate on the side walls and away from the colony, so that the colony, the cluster, never interacts with the water that is condensing inside of the hive. The way that we do that is through insulation. Now, depending on where you're at, this looks very different. I use 2-inch pink foam on my colonies in the UP, and it works very well. We lose less than 10% of our colonies every year. And generally, the colonies, the 1 or 2 colonies that we lose, are due to some sort of error on my part. Last year, it was starvation that took our 2 colonies out. And that was totally on me. So the way that when we're talking about insulation, the reason that it's so important is because we're trying to mitigate that 75% of heat loss through the top. We can handle the 25% on the side. And in fact, you do not need to insulate the sides of your colonies at all. If you do, it's not going to hurt. But the key factor is the top needs to be the most insulated, because if you insulate the side walls heavily and don't insulate the top covers the coldest part of the colony, and that is where all of your condensation is going to accumulate, and that is going to kill your colony in the winter. So if you insulate anything, the most important component of the hive to insulate is the top cover. It reduces condensation that builds up over the colony, and it drastically reduces heat loss. This is one of the keys when it comes to managing moisture, is making sure that that top cover is warm. It is also one of the keys to mitigating heat loss over the winter. Because like I said, 75% of heat loss goes through the top of the colony, or through the top of the hive. The last key to success for a lot of us in Michigan is wrapping. Now, wrapping is not insulation. It may prevent some wind from penetrating the hive, but it is not an insulating layer. There's very little R value to black tar paper. The black tar paper really comes into play in the spring. So in a lot of situations, and when I lived in lower Michigan, and we may not get snow until December or January, sometimes I would wrap colonies in December. It's not critical for the beginning of the season. What wrapping really is important for is the spring. And what it allows colonies to do is, by having this wrapped in black, basically heat is accumulating around the hive on warm days, and it allows that cluster to expand a little bit more. And during that expansion, they will be able to access some of those resources that were on the sides of the colony that the cluster was not able to get to when it was in cold conditions, in a real cold condition. So those warm-up days, those colonies the clusters can break, and they can access those outside resources. A lot of you that have kept bees in the past know that 10-frame equipment in overwintering situations, a lot of times those 2 outside frames never get touched. By wrapping the colonies like this, that's how they can access these resources. That cluster is able to expand much more rapidly. In addition, during this period of the season, when we're in kind of that that early warm-up stage where we may have like a week of 50-degree temperatures, but we plummet back into the 20s during the night times. This allows for a little bit of a buffer as well. So as the day goes on and the temperatures start to plummet very quickly, it gives the cluster a little more of a buffer to get itself back together more appropriately because of that heat accumulation from the tar paper. Tar paper is not critical. I've overwintered colonies just fine without tar paper, but it is an added step that you can use to help maximize that access to resources. And what it pretty much prevents doing is like that scenario I talked about in the beginning, where you may have a colony that, you know, maybe it hit a spot where there wasn't resources, but there were resources around them. The resources around them, that's how they access them, is by getting that colony warmed up through this black tar paper. And so it can prevent starving in place early in the season, meaning that, well, by starving in place, what I mean is that when we get into this time of the year, this kind of also builds on this, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but when we're in the spring time of the year is when new brood is being put on. And so at this time of the year, the priorities of the colony completely change. It's not just the cluster moving up as a unit. At this point in time, they will sit right on the brood, and the priority becomes the brood. They maintain that brood temperature at above 90 degrees, and they will not leave that brood no matter what. So the food has to be right next to it during this period of the time. And if we don't have that black tar paper on there, if there's not food immediately near that cluster, they may starve in place. And that's what I mean by starve in place, is that they're starving on the new brood because food is not immediately next to them. What this wrapping allows them to do, again, is to expand that cluster so that they can access more of those resources, which can help prevent starving in place. Okay, so that's all of the considerations for keys to success in the winter. Now I'm going to take you step by step on how to set your colonies up for this. Again, this is not rocket science, but what it is it really is, it's biological science, which is not as meticulous, it's not as precise as rocket science or, you know, things like that. When I was in Patriot batteries, you know, this isn't missile science. So what we're talking about here is something that there's a lot of flexibility to, and you need to understand that. But by doing this setup and by following what I just talked about, you have a very good chance of getting through the winter. But if you have done nothing for Varroa, none of this matters. So you need to make sure that that is always priority number one. But once you've got Varroa under control and you're ready to set your hive up for winter, to go through that long winter, this is what you're going to do. So number one, we're going to put upper and lower entrances in. I pretty much run upper entrances all season long. I rarely take them off, especially on overwintered colonies. They pretty much never come off. But if you're in a new situation, you may need to add an upper entrance. A lot of times those upper entrances can also be places where robbers can come in. And so you want to make sure that you're getting these things on as you're progressing later in the season. So an upper and lower entrance. In addition to serving as an air passage for airflow, your bees are going to have to get out sometime during the winter to defecate. They don't defecate in the colony. And so they need to have cleansing flights. And when you have snow, like the picture on the right, this is a box this is 5 boxes deep, and you can see only the 2 boxes on the top are exposed. You need to have a top entrance for them to be able to get out and go do their business on those warm days. So if you're completely buried in snow, you know, you're going to want to kind of dig those out as well. But you want to have a top entrance for airflow and for them to be able to do cleansing flights. The other thing, for those of you who are new to beekeeping, and I even get this from people that have been beekeeping for a couple of years, in the winter, people freak out because they see dead bees in front of the colony. You will have bees that die over the winter. And dead bees in front of a colony means that you have a colony that is still alive. If you don't have dead bees in front of a colony over the course of your winter, it means that colony is likely dead because they will do cleansing flights. You will see bees that will die outside of the colony. And generally, by the end of the season, the snow in front of your colony is going to be littered with dead bees. So that is a good sign. So just something to keep in mind. Upper and lower entrances. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to consolidate your resources, making sure that everything above your cluster is solid honey, that you don't have any gaps in resources where maybe the colony skipped a frame, or maybe you had supered too early and they just made a column of honey up the middle and didn't fill out the side frames. That's critically important that you have a full band of resources there. If you have colonies that are light on food or are weak, combine them with strong colonies or combine two weak colonies to create a decent colony. But you need to make sure that they've got enough food to get through the winter. You're going to add a spacer on the top of your colony. So once you get that colony situated to where it's just solid honey, it's brood at the bottom, solid honey, or however many supers you've got there. The very next thing above that last box of solid honey, so again, there is no empty boxes here. There's no empty frames, but your last solid box, you're going to put a spacer on. And that spacer is going to have a top entrance on it. The reason that you are adding a spacer here is because of supplemental feed. When you get to that point in the season where your bees are running out of food, this is where you're going to put that food. It's in this spacer gap. The one spacer you see here, I think this is a 1x2. All of my new spacers, I use 1x3, mainly because I just like the little added extra benefit of being able to fit more sugar in there. And generally on a 1x3, you can fit about 4 to 5 pounds of dry sugar in there. You can see on the right picture here, this is with a smaller spacer, and so there's less sugar in there. But it's either way, it's fine. But I like the 1x3 or 1x2. But you can see that space that spacer creates, not only are you getting a top entrance out of this, you also now have an area to put supplemental feed, which is really important that you go out and check during the season and make sure your bees have not run out of food, especially after the first of the year. Because if you've had really cold temperatures in the beginning of the year, they're going to motor through honey. And if you didn't have a lot of honey on, maybe only had 50 pounds on, by that time of the season could be a critical time for you where you may be running out of honey. So in this situation, the spacer gives you a place to put your fondant, your candy board, or in my case, or in what I would recommend is the mountain camp method, which is just newspaper and dry sugar on top of it. And again, that dry sugar will absorb moisture. So over time, even though this is, let me go back, this is granulated sugar right here, over the course of a couple of weeks, that's going to become saturated with water and it will become a brick. So it's not like you're going to have loose sugar in there the whole time. It will become a brick because it absorbs water. So you're kind of getting a twofer there. Moisture board. So you need some sort of a moisture wicking device. That can come in many different flavors. Some folks like to use a quilt box, and you can see this on the left here. This is a quilt box that I have in one of my apiaries. You can see that the way that this is set up is that we have our last box of honey here. I've got a spacer right here where I can add my supplemental food, and then directly above that is my quilt box. The quilt boxes, if you want to use a quilt box, they work just fine. The idea behind them is that you basically have a cavity that's full of wood chips, and those wood chips absorb a lot of the water that's coming off of your colony. So instead of having all of that moisture accumulate on the inner cover, it's accumulating inside of these wood shavings. And those wood shavings hold a bunch of water that mitigates it from draining back down onto the colony. It also has a twofer kind of function where it is also adding insulative factor to the top of the colony as well. That is one avenue. Another avenue is moisture boards, and moisture boards are widely available from your beekeeping supply companies. They are basically absorbent material that is in a board that you see pictured here. So immediately above your spacer that has your top entrance and is going to allow you to put supplemental feed in if you need it, is your moisture board or moisture wicking device. The nice thing about the moisture boards, excuse me, the thing I really like about the moisture boards, one, they're not very expensive. They're like $7 or $8 a piece. But number two is that they're reusable. So in the case of your quilt box, over the course of the winter, that quilt box, the shavings may get saturated in there and you may have to replace those shavings. Not a big deal. You dump the shavings out on next to the colony and you add some new shavings in there. The thing I like about the moisture board is when these moisture boards get saturated, you can tell they're saturated. So when I'm doing those mid-season checks to make sure I haven't gone through food, I'm also looking at the moisture board to see how much of it is frozen. If the whole board is frozen, all I do is I take that board, take it out, put a fresh board in, and then I take that saturated board into the house and let it dry out. And it's ready to go again once it's dry. So these are boards that you can use time and time again. I have some of these that I've been using for 4 and 5 years. They tend to last quite a long time. They do over time break down, mainly because of propolis being built up around the outsides. They'll start to get thin on the outsides because when you pull them off, a lot of the material will stay on the area that's been propolized. But I like moisture boards a lot. But you have a couple different varieties here as far as moisture wicking devices to mitigate that moisture that's building up in there. And in addition, you are adding insulative factor to the top of your colony. And that brings us to the next one. So you have your last box of honey, you have your spacer with your top entrance, you've got your moisture wicking device, whether that's a moisture board or a quilt box, and then the next piece of equipment that goes on is your insulation. This is not necessary everywhere. The pink insulation, when we had apiaries down in the Lansing area, I didn't always do this because really it just doesn't get cold enough down there. But here in the UP, I do this all the time because we hit some really long cold stretches. But you can add pink insulation. It's a nice small addition that doesn't cost very much to add to a colony. And again, it just adds to that insulative factor that's at the top of the colony where 75% of your heat is being lost. So by adding some insulation, we're losing less heat. We're also creating a situation where that is not the coldest surface in the colony where that moisture, excuse me, accumulates. The last thing, how do you wrap a colony? Well, it's kind of like wrapping a Christmas present, only with tar paper. So 15-pound tar paper is what I'm using here. You get it from Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards or wherever you do your shopping. And all you're going to do, what I like to do when I first start is I like to take a hive body, an empty hive body, set it on the ground with the tar paper. And basically I'll take that hive body, I'll set it on the tar paper as I pull out the tar paper, and then just wrap the tar paper around that single hive body to get a rough idea of how long of a piece of material I need. You don't want to take that whole roll and try and twist it around the colony, even though that's what it looks like, what's happening there in that first page. That's just a single cut. So it's just the roll that's going to go around this colony. This does not have to be exact. You can have a little bit of overlap on this, no problem. But you can see what I'm doing is I have taken that tar paper and I have stapled it to the back of the colony with a hand stapler. And then I just wrap the colony with it real nicely. And then I staple the back to the back of the other side to the back of the colony as well. I then come in with my pocket knife and I cut the edges on the corners of the tar paper. Note that the bottom box is not really covered. The bottom boxes are not important to be covered with this tar paper. It's the top boxes that really matter, because by the time this really comes into use in the beginning of the spring, kind of late winter, the bees are already going to be up in the colony. So you note that bottom box, I didn't even cover it. Not a big deal. You just want to make sure that those top boxes are really covered in this situation. So I leave about maybe 5 or 6 inches on the top, and then I cut those corners so that I can wrap this like a Christmas present. I fold it on all ends real nicely, and then I put my top cover on top of it. The reason that this works really nicely doing it this way is that when you come back to do your mid-season checks to look for food present, how far has the colony gone through food? Is the cluster at the top of the box? I'm literally just going to unwrap it, take off the top cover, unwrap that, and then pull that insulation out. And then all I do is I lift that moisture board, look and see where my bees are at. If I don't see them at the top, I just close it right up and I know that they're down below somewhere. So very easy way to check. And by folding this way, it makes it much easier to do these checks. That's pretty much it. That's how you're going to get your colony prepared for winter. Again, Varroa is number 1. Starvation is totally preventable, which would be like number 2 thing that's going to kill your bees. And then moisture is also really important as well. But if you follow what I've gone through with you here today, you should be in pretty darn good shape for doing this. If you've got any questions about this, go ahead and put those in the chat, and I will see you at the next lecture.